We'd read in last week's parsha that after Yossi's brother sold into slavery, they took the Ksonis Pasim, says they slaughtered a goat and they dipped it, they coated into the blood, and they brought it to Yaakov. So the obvious question is, what do we have to, why does Torah have to tell us it was a goat? They slaughtered an animal, they dipped it in its blood and brought it to Yaakov. Why does Torah make it a point? Serizim, the goat. It was goat's blood. So Rashi explains, in the name of Chazal, of the Midrash, because of all blood of animal, the blood that resembles human blood is the blood of a goat. That's why they chose goat's blood. Okay? So when Yaakov sees it, he should understand that this is the blood of his son, and otherwise he would have immediately detected and understood that this blood is the blood of an animal. Dam soer kedam odom. That's Chazal. That's what the Torah tells us. It was goat's blood. So the moment I read that Chazal, this Pei Shabbos, the first thing came to mind. The sin offering that's brought in the Beis Hamikdash. Every sin offering is a goat. It's not a lamb, it's a goat. On Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol takes two identical goats and he draws lots. One lot is Lashem. It's what it's brought. Its blood goes into the Holy of Holies. And the other goat is thrown down the mountainside to atone for the sins of the Jewish people. It's a goat. Now, the Rabban writes, when a person brings a korban, the Torah says it's korban Lashem. It's only within the context of Midas HaRachmin. The truth is, a person sins even inadvertently, he deserves to be put to death. He deserves to be slaughtered. His blood should be sprinkled on the Mizbeach. He deserves to be burnt. But Midas HaRachmin says we take the animal in the place of the person. If the person does tshuva and he verbally confesses the sin, Hashem, I take the animal being slaughtered, I accept as if the person is being slaughtered, his blood is being sprinkled, and his body, the body of the animal is the person. And the person in his mind has to have the understanding that it's only Midas HaRachmim that Hashem is willing to forgive him and be fully atoned through the animal. That's the concept of bringing a korban. That's the Midas HaRachmim. So why is the goat the species you bring for atonement? Because the goat, of all animals, species, and the Gemara tells us, En kaparel v'dam. What happens if you sprinkle the blood and then the animal becomes contaminated or the animal goes lost, the remains of the animal? The person is atoned. Why? Because the primary atonement comes through the sprinkling of the blood. Why? Kidamu hanefesh. Because blood is the life of all living creatures. So therefore, kapora is bedam. Atonement comes through the blood. So which blood are you sprinkling on the Mizbeach? The blood of the goat, which is of all animals, its blood resembles a human being's blood. This is what came to mind. Therefore, the Torah chooses the goat for chatos, for the sin offering, and on the ultimate korban, on Yom Kippur, which brings atonement for Klal Yisrael, whether it's the goat thrown down the mountainside or the goat that's slaughtered and its blood is sprinkled in the Holy of Holies, opposite the paroches, it's the goat for that reason. Okay? That's the first thing that came to mind. And then we find Chazal tell us what was the blueprint for existence, for creation. So the Medrash says, Istaklu b'oraisa bara alma. God looked into the Torah and he created the world. What does that mean? For instance, you have 5 species of grain. When you add water to them, the leavening process starts. Why? Other species, if it's rice, not. It's specifically 5 species of grain. You know why? Because there's a negative commandment in the Torah. It's called chometz. So God had to create the world that within these 5 species, that when you add water, it starts leavening, and that's chametz. The only species which qualifies for matzah to fulfill the mitzvah of the positive commandment of eating matzah the 15th night is only the 5 grains, because it has to be a grain, it has to be a species that if you don't watch over, it becomes leavened. So the reason why God created these 5 species is because there's a mitzvah of eating matzah, and there's a negative commandment that you're not permitted to eat chametz. The halacha is that tefillin, sefer Torah, mezuzah, the parchment or the leather, has to come from a kosher species. So why do kosher species have hides? God created kosher species with hides because since there's one needs tefillin, one needs sefer Torah, one needs mezuzah, and can only come from a kosher species, automatically God had to create kosher species because there's a mitzvah called tefillin, sefer Torah, mezuzah. So that's the blueprint. Istalka boraisa borei alma. God used the Torah as the blueprint. Whatever exists in existence, because it has relevance to the Torah itself. That's the understanding. Because a human being is prone to fail, and he needs kapara, and he needs atonement. And atonement has to come through a goat, because its blood resembles a human being's blood. That's the reason God created the goat with blood, which is very unique. All other animal blood doesn't resemble human blood. But the goat, which is a species which is needed for kapara, its blood resembles the human blood that you can't discern between the goat blood and the human blood. This is what he said on Shabbos. The Torah says that when God finished creating the world, he saw everything was tov ma'od. Tov ma'od. What's ma'od? One interpretation is the letters ma'od and odom are the same letters. Everything said and done, what was so special about creation? Because ultimately it has a value because for man. But the Midrash says, Tov Ma'od ze Yitzhara. The evil inclination, that was brought it to that special level. Why? Because if man doesn't have choice, a man naturally does good, his action is not attributed to himself. It's only because there's an evil inclination, a man meets these challenges, and he has the ability to overcome it. So therefore, the action, the result is attributed to the person, whether it's positive or negative. So even the negative choice is only after both sides of the equation. So all the persecutions throughout history, all those consequences, and these are all outgrowths of making bad choices. That's part of creation because that's the other side of choice. You wouldn't have choice unless you have both sides, the positive and the negative. You've chosen the negative. You chose the negative, then the consequences for the negative. You chose the positive, there are also the consequences, but the positive consequences. That's the other side of the equation. That's the balance. The Gemara tells us a number of locations, specifically this location. It says, Vayerev Vayevoker. It was evening and it was day. It was morning. So Gemara says, Erev is Olam Hazeh. Erev is this world. The physical world is Erev. Boker is Yemos HaMashiach. That's Boker. Light comes, everything's illuminated. At night, everything's distorted. Night is distortion. You see something with this lack of light, you believe it to be one thing, it turns out to be something else. When morning comes with the sufficient light, you see clearly. So Erev is Olam Hazeh. That's the physical world which we live in right now. What's Boker? Yemos HaMashiach, where all evil will be expunged, removed from this existence. That's Boker. So the Gemara says something interesting. The Gemara says, in every flock of sheep, most sheep are white. They have white wool or gray wool. In every flock of sheep, they're goats. The goats always lead the pack. Most goats, I'm into animal, I'm an expert in what animals are supposed to look like. Goats are black, dark. Why did the goats lead the pack? The dark animal goes first, and then the sheep, which is white, follows. Because it says, Vayer Vayivoker, first night comes, then morning comes. So the way, the order manifests itself in the flock of sheep, that it's always led by the goat, which is dark black, followed by the sheep that are white. You got it? What's the cause of all sin? The cause of all sin is what? Because things aren't clear. And that's the challenge of life. Despite the lack of ambiguity of life, you have to be able to resist temptation or overcome conflicts and see it right. That's what life's all about. That's Olam Hazeh. That's dark. That's the goat. What's the goat represent? The goat represents the human being. As I said, because the blood of the goat is what resembles the blood of a human being. The hair of the sheep is called fleece. It's not called hair. The goat is called hair. The human being has hair. I'm just saying, the many resemblances between the goat and the human being. That's our challenge. That despite the darkness, we have to make choices which are correct choices. And God gave us the mechanisms. What are the mechanisms? It's called Torah. Torah is the instrument which sheds light and illuminates the darkness despite the darkness. And even we still fail. And Shlomo says there's no perfect tzaddik, but even there's no perfect tzaddik, but still you can do tshuva. And the Gemara says in Brachos that if you saw a Talmid Chacham sitting at night, you shouldn't suspect him in the morning because Varios a tshuva. Because he's a Talmid Chacham, by morning he ready to tshuva. Because nobody's perfect. We have our vulnerabilities. But even though we have our vulnerabilities, but because he's a Talmid Chacham, he has Torah, he takes hold of himself, and due to that level of clarity, he makes the correction, which is called tshuva. We read in last week's parsha those story. Yosef's in prison, and all of a sudden, the two ministers of the king are put into prison, and Yosef becomes their valet. He's appointed that he should accommodate, take care of all their needs. And each of them has a dream. He interprets the dreams, and that's what follows in this week's reading, this week's parsha. So over there it says they were put in the prison which Asiri HaMelech Asurim. That's last week's parsha. That the ministers of the king, when they were incarcerated, this was the prison. It was a special prison. It was the prison Asiri HaMelech Asurim. People who were part of the royal palace, the ministers, they were imprisoned in this prison. Now, Asiri, the way it's spelled, is with a vav, not with a yud. If you read it as the way it reads, it should say Asuri HaMelech. We say Matir Asurim, right? Every day we say Birchas HaShachar. Matir Asurim. A person, Asur means you're in prison, you're incarcerated. But over there, the pronunciation is Asiri HaMelech. So the Baal Torah makes it a point. Why the ksiv, the spelling is vav, and the pronunciation should be Asuri HaMelech, but yet the pronunciation is Asiri HaMelech with the yud. Why? So, how many years did Yosef spend in prison? Until that time, he was there 10 years. He was there 9 years. They came in the 10th year. He stayed an extra 2 years because he lacked faith, because he asked the minister of the wine to remember him and mention him to Paro, which was a lack of faith. But he was meant to be there 10 years. Why 10 years? So the way I always said, and Alan would remember this, is because the Gemara tells us in Sota, then when he was nearly seduced by his mistress, by Potiphar's wife, he became so overwhelmed with desire for her, he lost 10 droplets of semen. Initially, Yosef was supposed to have 12 sons. Each son was supposed to be a tribe. But because he lost 10 droplets of semen, every droplet he lost the son. He did not have those sons. He only had two. Ephraim and Nasha had the same status as what? As Reuben and Shimon. Although they were the grandchildren of Yaakov, But status-wise, they have the status of shvatim, of tribes. So the way I always understood, the reason why he spent 10 years in prison is because, according to the Maharal, what is the concept of prison? We speak of shibud. Shibud means you're controlled, you're dominated. Your life is controlled. A prisoner, he has no, he's totally limited in his activity. The warden dictates the life of the prisoner, physical limitation and other limitations. A slave has no identity. The slave exists based on the dictate of the master. He's a chattel. Imprisoned is that. Now, why does a person deserve to be imprisoned? Because you allowed your other things to take over your life. As you allowed your desire to dictate, and you did not take control to be an independent person. We say by the Luchos, it says, Choros ala Luchos. In Pirkei Avos, last in the 6th chapter of Pirkei Avos, it says Choros ala Luchos. The 10 commandments were Choros, were etched onto the Luchos. Atikri Choros el Chevus. Elucha ben Chorin el Mishosik b'Talmud Torah. Who's the free man? The one who studies Torah. So how do you take control of your life? Not allow life should dictate you, should take over your life. Talmud Torah. So the way you live as a spiritual being, not as a physical being, not to be influenced, but you should be the influencer, is only through the Torah itself. A person who's affected and overtaken by his environment, he's like incarcerated. He's actually limited. Yosef, by moving 10 droplets, each droplet, he succumbed to temptation. Because he succumbed to that degree of temptation, therefore he lost 10 droplets. For each droplet, which was considered, the loss is considered not fathomable, he spent a year in prison, which is ultimate incarceration. Your life is controlled by and limited by being imprisoned. That's the way I always learned. That's the 10 years. The additional 2 years was because he succumbed. He was beside himself. He was desperate. And because of that desperation, he said 2 words. For the additional 2 words, he spent another 2 years in prison. That's the way I always learned with the Maharal. The Maharal doesn't say it, but that's with the concept, that's the way I understood it. The Baal HaTurim says it should be read Asuri HaMelech, but we read it Asiri HaMelech, because he spoke Lashon Hara about his 10 brothers. It says he brought Dibara Loviv, he tailbeared. He brought negative information to Yaakov about his brothers. So for each brother speaking Lashon Hara, he spent a year in prison. That's Asiri HaMelech. That's the way it's spelled. It's not pronounced Asure. The spelling is Vav, but the pronunciation is Yud. The Yud connotes the Lashon Hara against 10 of his brothers. Now, the beginning of this parsha, after 2 years, he spent an additional 2 years. That's because of the story with the Sarah Mashkin, with the minister of wine, the wine steward. That's the beginning of this parsha.